Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Warren County Hazard Mitigation Plan update session. This is on the topic of risk and vulnerability assessment for the 2027 plan update. My name is Sean Cannon. I'm with Michael Baker. I will be supporting the county work through the Hazard Mitigation Plan update, and I will be working alongside Dennis Riley, who is the project manager on the county side. This is the agenda for this presentation. We're just going to give a general overview on what hazard mitigation is and the project, the risk assessment portion of our findings and how we're going about it, the vulnerability assessment, some of the highlights we found while we were writing the update portion of it, and the next steps after this session. So hazard mitigation. This is the definition from the Code of Federal Regulations. So hazard mitigation is any sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risks to human life and property from hazards. Hazard mitigation planning is a coordinated process used by state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to identify their risks and vulnerabilities associated with the natural disasters and to develop and implement strategies to reduce or eliminate long-term risks. So this workshop here, this presentation is regarding that identifying the risks and vulnerability section of the plan. And we do this because the hazard mitigation plan is the blueprint to developing mitigation strategies to reduce risk in the future and create a more resilient community. So you can't really mitigate against a risk if you don't know what those hazards or vulnerabilities are, those risks or vulnerabilities. So that's why this portion is so important when developing the mitigation plan. And this is our six steps of the process. The first being gathering input from stakeholders. This happens throughout the entire project. This is through meetings like this. This is through online surveys. This is reaching out to local stakeholders such as businesses or community representatives. And we're taking that information and adding it into the plan update. The next part is developing the risk and vulnerability assessment. That's what we're working on here. That's the information we've been creating using mapping and local knowledge. Then capability assessment, that's looking at what capabilities the communities have in the county regarding responding, recovering to disasters, and of course, funding for mitigation strategies and resilience projects for the future. Then developing those mitigation strategies, so looking at the hazards and risks and vulnerabilities, developing strategies to reduce those risks for future. The next step is determining a plan maintenance process. Our goal is to not just create a hazard mitigation plan and let it sit on the shelf for 5 years until it has to be renewed again, but to have something actionable that you could pull out and either if a risk or a hazard happens or are ready to begin the next mitigation process, you could pull it off the shelf and it's a useful plan. And lastly, obtaining mitigation plan approval and adoption. You can't just write the plan. I mean, you can, but if you want to have more access to funding after a disaster or an event, or if you want your community to have access to flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program, you need to have an adopted plan by both the state and the federal FEMA level. This is where we are in the process. We are looking at now public meeting 2, that's the risk and vulnerability assessment. And going forward in February, we will be looking through the mitigation strategies developed with the county and go over if we want to make any changes, and then have a final review of that draft plan come March. And then from April until January goes through that review process of the state and federal levels, reviewing the plan to make sure everything looks good and if they have any recommendations for improving it. So now the risk assessment. What is a risk assessment? It's a process that helps communities understand what those risks are, whether they're natural or man-made events that impact them. It helps share those vulnerabilities, and we'll go over that very soon, and then inform decision making. So again, the whole purpose of this is to know what hazards could impact the county and the community level, and who's at most vulnerable. It could be related to age, it could be related to economics, businesses, it could be related to the disability level. So we're looking at all the vulnerabilities uh, together to inform decision making, what mitigation strategies we want to use in the future. And so the risk assessment provides the basis for mitigation strategies to reduce losses. Again, everything I keep saying is that it's important to have that risk assessment in place so you know where those risks are. And of course, nothing's so black and white on a map. So it's important to have these meetings to reach out to the community, to talk to the people, to understand that not everything can show up on a map. So where those risks are, help us develop the strategy to reduce loss in the future. The risk is not just made up of hazards. This is a great image from the FEMA planning guide that shows that hazards can make up location, extent, and magnitude, the impact that hazard has on the portion of the community. Has an event happened in the past before? And also, what's the future probability of it happening again or at all? And then there's the community assets of that risk. So who's at risk? The people, the structures, what systems and infrastructures are in place, from roads to telecommunication, valued activities. Is there natural, historic, cultural resources that could be impacted? And if they're lost, what does that mean for your community? These are all things that have to be taken into account when looking at risk. And looking at the considerations, again, we want to look at previous occurrences. Has this happened before in the past? And how long the event impacted, from how long it hit. Say you have a flood event that took over 2 days, and then it took a year to recover from. Those are all things that have to be considered. What type of damage occurred based on that event? And then the local knowledge. Again, we could look at a FEMA map from the Map Surma Center, but everything, as you know, as they say, where it rains, it could flood. So it might not show or represent the community as you know it. And that's why we like to meet with you to go over what that local knowledge looks like and how we can incorporate it into the plan. What's the probability of it occurring in the future? We're looking at, has it happened in the past multiple times? Likelihood it could happen again. A qualitative and regional data approach. So we are looking at maps and bringing in data from uh, insurance claims and the information from you at the local community level. And then historical analysis. What does the past look like and how it can predict the future, um, especially with climate warming and shifting and changing. You know, New Jersey is looking at tornadoes now like we haven't before. The past recent years, things have changed, and earthquakes as well. You know, looking at recent history could inform our future decision making on mitigation projects. And then this evaluate the state hazard mitigation plan. They completed a recent plan update, and does it look similar to what the county is representing as well? Is there anything that can be incorporated from the state plan that want to be addressed in the county level plan? And then the cascading risks. These are things you have to think about that, okay, there's no homes in this area, but if a road is damaged and that creates a reduced access to the neighboring community for, say, an ambulance or fire department to approach, like it's not just the exact damage of that hazard or risk, but what cascading impacts that could have. If a flood happens and the power goes out, and there is a community of folks, say 65 and older, they might have a higher risk of heat issues if they lose air conditioning, loss of food, things like that that we have to consider when looking at risk and vulnerability. Again, we're looking at the county and town level. It's a multi-jurisdictional plan. We know that every community doesn't look the same. The county could look at the communities as a whole together, but it's important for us to talk to every community to know what hazards and risks they face when it comes to a hazard impacting the community. If they have uh, a power plant, a water treatment plant compared to another community that does not. These are things we want to know. Like if there is a mine, if there's historical mines underground, that could impact the community. If there were earthquakes compared to the one right next door, that's not impacted by that. So the county level of the plan looks at every single, it looks at a combined assessment of risks, while it's important that we talk to each community to capture what their needs are and what mitigation strategies would best improve or impact their resiliency for the future. So here's a list of the hazards that were identified in the previous plan. You'll see there's two red ones. Those are new ones that were added for this plan update after we had our last meeting with the county and communities. So those are dam failure, drought, earthquake, flooding, geological hazards as landslides, and substance sinkholes and mines is a new one we're adding. Hurricanes, tropical storms, northeasters, severe weather, high winds, tornadoes, thunderstorms, hail, extreme temperature, severe winter storms, that's heavy snow, blizzards, ice storms, and ice jams, wildfires, and then harmful algae is a new one that the state plan has added and the county wanted to add as well. The human caused hazards, they have not changed from the previous plan. Those are hazardous materials such as fixed sites and in transit, animal disease, civil unrest, crop failure, cyber attack, economic collapse. Pandemic was a new one added in the last plan update, which was written during COVID, and then power failure and terrorism. Next, we'll be going over identifying and profiling those hazards. So after looking at that list in the plan, we're going to explore these four topics when profiling each hazard. That is the location. So that will be through maps and narrative, the extent, so how much it can impact from historical knowledge and potential reoccurrence. Those previous occurrence will add them to the plan if there have any new ones in the past 5 years that need to be added. Otherwise, that won't be changed, or it will have slight updates, and then the probability of the event happening in the future. That could include new maps that we know about, new development that happened in the community that we need to capture in the new plan. So these are things we have to consider when we are writing and adopting the new plan. And of course, what new data is available to answer these questions is also important. Extent is a big a big part of this plan because it differs from just like looking at a map where the lines are, you're in or out of the flood zone. It doesn't show, like see in this picture over here on the right, it could be in a tornado zone, but based on how old the structures are, how severe a tornado may be, it'll impact, it'll create a either stronger or lower reduced extent of damage. So those are important things we have to capture in the plan, especially if we have the knowledge that it's happened in the past and what could occur in the future regarding climate change or adaptation and development in the community. So we're going to be looking at and make sure to capture the speed of onset of hazard event and the duration. Again, if flooding occurs for a long period of time, if people can't live in their homes, lose power for a long period of time, how would that impact property owners or businesses and the local economy? And then the speed of onset is also really important because it allows people, do we have enough time for people to get out of harm's way? And do we have enough emergency management folks to get to folks who were unable to reach safety and need rescue and so forth? And again, comparing that to the state hazard mitigation plan, if there's anything new we could capture from that plan or anything we feel like wasn't captured in that plan that we could add to ours, That's why we look at that here. But this is just to show you a couple examples of how the maps will look in the plan. This is the county's look at the existing FEMA flood maps. We pull this flood map data from FEMA, and then here is that local inland flood elevation data. You can see they're a little different. That's why it's important to not just get information from one source, but to overlay it with other information. Inland funding is going to look different than a FEMA floodplain. And again, these are not just gray and white, black and white. It's a very gray when it comes to this, but this is just something to go off of as a starting point when writing this plan. And for each community, we will look at it a zoomed in approach at the local level. So this is what a map would look like for the FEMA floodplain. And you could see that it shows the different flood zones and if we have that base flood elevation information. And here's a different look, different community for inland flooding elevation data. It'll look different, but it's important to capture both types of maps. Here's another one, completely different hazard or risk, but looking at wildfire, that's a wildland urban interface data. And it looks at the risks of condensed, natural areas that could be a higher risk of burning, or an intermix, which is a mix of residential or commercial structures, along with risks of wildfires in nature. And here's just another version of a zoomed in approach on how we'll capture that information in the plan. Another important portion of this plan that we talked about at the last presentation or the last meeting was that high hazard potential dams are really important to capture it in the hazard mitigation plan, because doing so allows whoever owns those high hazard dams to potentially get funding in case in the event that something had impacted the dam itself in a hazard event. So say flooding broke through when the dam broke, there is a chance for that dam owner to have access to federal funding. So if we don't have this in the plan, if we don't meet the criteria of having high hazard potential dams in the plan, then that funding may not be available to those dam owners. So this is what that would look like. You see the red there is a high hazard potential dams, but it doesn't mean other dams aren't significant or at risk. There is low hazard dams that, at the local level, they have knowledge that are face great risk, but they're not captured in this map. And same thing with significant hazard potential dams. In the vulnerability assessment of this portion, community assets, kind of going back to that chart that showed the who's at risk on one side and the hazards on the other. People, that's, our goal is to get people out of harm's way through mitigation strategies. That's who's at risk and vulnerable. The built environment, so what structures are at risk, not just homes and businesses, but also critical facilities from hospitals, schools, to phone, telecommunication, internet access. Looking at natural resources, are there animals, endangered species who are at risk? Are there rivers or streams that could be moved with sediment settling? And again, the economy as an asset. If businesses can't open and there are high producers of taxes and things like that in the community, then how does it impact the community as well? Or job loss for those who are faced with the event. And this time around, we're going to be pulling in FEMA's community lifelines that's looking at into those hazard profiles: communications, food, water, shelter, hazard materials, energy and power, fuel. It could be anything from natural gas to solar, health and medical facilities, safety and security, transportation, and water systems. So in the plan, we identify the critical assets and systems. There We are pulling from the old one and then updating, adding new ones if anything has been added in the past 5 years in the community or county. It helps tell the story of the county's risks and ties it to future mitigation practices or actions we want to take. Of course, if we want to make sure that these critical facilities are protected from those risks. So that's why we look at access to the hospital or pharmacies and medication. These are important things to focus on when mitigating risks. And then consider the effects of climate change, population change, and land use change. You know, development is still occurring in New Jersey. There's more houses being built and roads being designed and structures being added. So things change over 5 years. And again, climate change has impacted the county with or the state of New Jersey as a whole from looking at tornadoes over the past couple years and earthquakes that hit last summer. These are things that we have to take into account and at least consider when writing this plan. So looking at impact and vulnerability, there's two different things here. The different ways a hazard can affect a community. What is the impact? It affects lives. Are you at risk of safe? Are you in a safe space? It affects structures. Can people get back into their homes, back into their businesses and work? Uh, are roads accessible? Facilities that need to be accessed or businesses impacted? And historical value. They're historic structures or famous buildings that have been there for 100+ years, or trees that are preserved or registered on historic registries. These are things that we have to record in that plan as well. And then the vulnerabilities, weaknesses or gaps in protection to exposed assets. That's characteristics of a population, age and condition of infrastructure, proximity to hazard, and capacity. And we can't just look at a risk on a map. We have to know how if there's a dense population of folks who are not English speaking or 65 and older over here that may need a different type of care when it comes to recovery and response. These are all things that go into the vulnerability assessment. So here are some of the highlights we've found while doing that portion of this mitigation plan. Overall, Warren County, it's seen growth of about 3.7% over the past 10 years. This just highlights some of that growth. The numbers on top are the ones that have seen the highest amount of growth. It's Alamucci Township, Oxford, and Washington. And they're all around, they're around 17% to 12.5%. And then there's some municipalities that have declining populations, Frelinghuysen, Hardwick, and Liberty. But again, it looks like percent change is around 12% to 5%. But if you look at the numbers, it's roughly some of them between losing 150 people, things like around those numbers. So there hasn't been that much declining population in the county as a whole. Warren County, it's skewed slightly higher compared to New Jersey. Not by much though, but it also has faster growth in population of folks 65 and older over the past 10 years. Warren County around 2020, around the census, the 2014 and 2018 census was around 17.2%, and the last one was 19%. So a 10% growth in population of 65 and older. That's pretty on par with New Jersey as a whole at around 8.4%. Over a quarter of the population in White Township and Alamucci and Frelinghuysen are 65 and older. So White Township White Township has roughly 40%. It's just highest compared to Alamucci and Frelinghuysen, which is around 26%. And then an estimated 4.6% of Warren County is aged 5 and younger. with most of the community estimates between 4 and 7. There's not much difference between the communities as a whole. They all lie in there, other than Washington Township, which had a smaller population of less than 1% under the age of 5 and under. These are more highlights of the vulnerable populations. Warren County has 8.12% of the residents living in poverty, which is lower than New Jersey as a whole, which is around 10%, which is a good thing. 11.74% of the county are living with at least one disability. It's slightly higher than New Jersey's average, which is 10.63. And then in Warren County, the language, speaking more than one language at home other than English, is around 14.57%, which is half of New Jersey's average, which is around 32.66%. So mostly English speaking in the county as a whole. So housing across New Jersey, across the country, across the globe right now is facing higher risk burden and higher rent cost burden and ownership burden. The prices are higher now than they have been for a while. Warren County has relatively higher rent cost burden at the countywide level. It's estimated at 44.35% of households spending 30% or more of their take-home income on housing costs. And similarly, for home ownership, that's around 25.35% of homeowners who spend 30% or more of their income on housing. It's a vulnerability that has to be considered there because of housing security, likely fewer resources to support resilience through disaster if a lot of the money goes towards housing, and that could lead to concerns of folks being able to get back into their homes after an event if their house is damaged, or if they need to move, if they could afford anything else in the county, or afford to move outside the county, or if they don't want to move at all. These are all things that have to be considered with housing prices nowadays. And also, they compound, and not just high prices of living, but also will there be income changes if you lose your job or business? Are there disabilities? Someone in the home is facing, can't get back into work, so they can't afford a different price for renting or owning a house. And then language isolation. Are they in a community where they're able to speak to their neighbors and work for a business or company that speaks the same language as them? Employment in the county. This is a chart we like to see. We like to see a lot of colors on it. We like to see a uh, diverse number of industries in the community, because if everyone was working for one business and that business had faced a hazard or risk, then the concern would be everyone would lose their jobs or lose their income, and that would impact the economy as a whole. If people could stay in their homes, if county was collecting taxes or state, and a long-term cascading impacts of that. So I like to see a diverse number of uh, businesses and work in the community and industries. As far as next steps of the plan, we are in January meeting with the communities one-on-one. We'll sit down with them to go over their personal and individual hazards and mitigation strategies. We'll look at the previous plan, see if they had completed any of the strategies they had written in the plan, if they want to change them, if they want to add new ones or remove old ones. That's what we'll be talking about with them come January. In February, we'll go over the mitigation strategies. We'll do this at the county level, looking at mitigation strategies that want to be incorporated or removed or added, or if any of them have been completed, we'll be updating it then and discussing the mitigation strategies for the future. And then a fourth session in March, we'll go over the mitigation plan as a whole and what we'll be submitting to the state for review. And if you want to contact the planning team, the first thing you want to do is reach out to your community. If you go to the county website, which is available here, there's a hazard mitigation plan section. There's an email in there that you could write to. So you'll be reaching out to Diane, who's supporting the project management side of this, along with Dennis. And you'll also find like this recording there, along with future recordings if you can't meet the next couple sessions, and public surveys that you can answer to help us develop the mitigation plan or bring it up to the county. If it's something we want to include in the plan or think that needs to be addressed, then that's the best way for your voice to be heard. And we need that input to know what is happening in your community and what's being impacted. Our goal is to not sit over here and write this plan just based off of data. We need the information from you, so please make sure you share that with the planning team. These are questions that will be asked in those surveys, in the one-on-one sessions with the community, so to think about ahead of time, where are hazards experienced? So you see your map from that last plan. Is this accurate? Are you seeing the flooding occurring here, or is it occurring completely outside of the mapped area? What are your biggest concerns? We might meet with one community and their biggest concern might be their concern would be loss of a bridge in the community, while the other one would be like, this is the hospital that all the neighboring communities go to. So these are things we have to consider with what the biggest concerns are for risk and vulnerability. And it's important for us to capture changes in development within the community. Are you seeing a ton of development over here, or it's just slightly near a floodplain or an area that experienced earthquake or flooding in the past? Are you seeing folks move out of certain areas or concerned about this area is fairly low income, and what concerns you might have as far as risks there in the future, and if development is going to impact them by maybe increasing their risk of flooding because the neighboring community is building up and creating more land that can absorb water. These are all things we have to consider when writing the vulnerability and mitigation strategies for the future. So thank you for your time. You can reach out to myself at this email here, but I highly recommend you reach out to Diane and Dennis first. They're here for you at the county level to answer your questions, and I'm happy to support them in any way I can. But I appreciate you taking the time to listen to the risk assessment and vulnerability assessment portion of the hazard mitigation plan, and look forward to getting your input in the surveys and hope to see you at the next meeting. And appreciate your time. So thank you. And again, feel free to reach out to Diana and Dennis regarding any concerns about future risks and hazards and mitigation strategies you have in mind for the future of your county. Thank you.